لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله.
Let's look at some of the questions that were asked. One of the questions being, you mentioned inwardness as something discovered through the meditation experience. Could you describe this a bit more?
Sure. In regards to inwardness, inwardness is known in spirituality or for those who practice meditation as an experience, a state of being where one experiences that one's attention has finally in some way turned inwards. So this sense of inwardness is the mind, as attention having turned inwards, after having been, outward and scattered in its attentiveness to various objects, to external stimuli, to sounds we're hearing in the meditation experience, to any physical sensations on the body. All of these are considered outward objects of attention. Even our thoughts, which are more subtle and as it were inside of us, that's not inwardness yet. If we go from attending from the point of view of our mind to objects outside of us, to then objects inside of us, which could be thoughts or even emotions or feeling states, inwardness is even a step back from that. It's when the mind turns in upon itself. So usually when a meditator or when a spiritual contemplative or a mystic speaks of inwardness in their practice and even in their life, it's really about this in the contemplative life, that the attention has turned inwards upon itself. Not inwards upon personal thoughts or personal feelings, but rather even beyond that to an inwardness that turns on itself into some other place. That place in which the mind now has turned inwards is the heart, or the inner, element of our being, the inner aspect of our being. So that's really what inwardness means. It's usually encountered as a state of being. It's a feeling, it's a state, it's an experience. So we all know how it feels to have a scattered mind, especially at the beginning of meditation, right? And we all, inshallah, know how it feels in our practice to have the mind and the attentive energies a bit more gathered. There's a certain feeling to that, but that attentive concentrativeness is still pointing somewhat outward, right? Either at our attention to an invocation, our attention to Quranic recitation, our attention to even contemplating the meanings of what we're reading. All of this is a focused meditation practice, but it's pointed, kind of outwards to some degree. It's not as scattered and outward as a scattered mind is, but it's focused but pointed in that direction, in this direction, to whatever we're holding or we're concentrating on. Now, inwardness is when this attention or the energy of the attention receives back into itself and turns around, as it were, and begins to sink into the source of its beingness, which would be the spiritual heart. So that experience, that feeling, that knowing is contemplative or meditative inwardness. And as an experience, it has a very subtle sense, but it can turn into a mode of living. It can be a station, as the Sufis would say. It can go from a hal to a maqam, to a conscious standing where one's attention is entirely inward on themselves, their own presence, or the divine presence that is discovered to be at the root of one's being. So when we speak of meditation in a general sense, and this sense of inwardness, this is really what we mean, especially in this Islamic practice.
Follow-up to that, you mentioned the difference between a little bit more of a subtle inward meditative experience where you might be meditating on an invocation or even a Quranic ayah, and that has its place. But you mentioned that inwardness here is something even more subtle than that, intransitive. And you mentioned in specific meditating upon the self. Could you help me a bit more on that? Because the way I conceptualize the self, it comes across as an object. You know,
Sure.
I think of self as a transitive thing.
Yes, that's an excellent question. Actually, meditating on the self is not a conceptualization or even a philosophical inquiry into what is the nature of the self in an objective sense, in an intellectual sense. It's more, inwardness is more the receding of the attention and the returning or bringing attention to the subject that is meditating. So in meditation, in the meditation process, the subject that is meditating is usually meditating upon an object, to whatever that object is, or in other words, concentrating on an object of attention. But now imagine that one becomes aware that they're attending to an object. And then that same subject turns that attention upon themselves, the very source of that attention directingness. That turning around and bringing attention back to the subject who is meditating, that one could say is the beginning of a sense of inwardness. So this kind of meditating upon the self, upon the subject that is the meditator, is more of an existential experience. It's more of a, what would be the word here? It's more of an experiential knowing of oneself, not a conceptualizing in the mind, but actually a receding back into ourselves and knowing ourselves by presence, by a sense of presence. And so this kind of turning around, as it were, and sinking into our own selves and bringing attention to the very subject that is performing the meditation, that's what we mean by inwardness, or as you formulated it, meditating upon the self. Right? It's one thing to meditate upon our actions, to what we did in the day, which is usually a very well-known Muhasaba practice, or the practice of self-accounting, of our deeds, of how we were feeling, what kind of thoughts we were having, how we handled, other situations or human beings. In the day, and then returning back unto God and asking either for forgiveness or thanking God for having sustained some element of spiritual presence, and being more present for all of those circumstances. That's one thing, meaning that self-accountability or self-accountingness, Muhasaba as we call this in meditative practice. But that's not meditation on the self. Meditation on the self, because from this angle, all those things are still, objects of our attention, other actions that we did. But meditating upon the self is bringing attention to oneself, to the subject that is meditating, and inquiring contemplatively, quite naturally, into the nature of this meditating subject, or unto the nature of the self. That's meditation on the self. That's really the real kind of subtle meaning of what it means to meditate upon the self, or to awaken to a sense of inwardness.
لا إله إلا الله 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 لا إله إلا الله